The fluorescent lights above his desk buzzed with that particular frequency that made my back teeth ache. And I sat with my hands folded in my lap like a schoolgirl waiting for punishment, thinking about how 3 weeks ago the biggest problem in my life was a broken radiator and a pile of medical bills I kept moving from one drawer to another so I didn't have to look at them. "You're not leaving this office until you explain yourself." His voice was quiet. That was the thing about Stellan Voss that nobody warned you about. The quieter he got, the more dangerous he became. "So I suggest you start talking, Josephine." Except he'd never called me Josephine. Not once in 3 weeks. That was how I knew how bad this was. Let me go back. 3 weeks ago, I was Jo Mercer, 28 years old, single mother to a 5-year-old named Hazel, working the dinner shift at Crestwood Grill, a steakhouse on the north side of Chicago that was expensive enough to attract the kind of clientele I'd only ever seen on the covers of business magazines. I took the job because the tips were extraordinary, and because the health insurance kicked in after 90 days, and Hazel's pediatric pulmonologist was not cheap. I wore black slacks and a white button-down every night, and I smiled at men in $1,000 suits, and I told myself that the exhaustion was temporary, that I was building towards something, even if I couldn't see it yet. The night he walked into Crestwood, I almost didn't notice him. Almost. The restaurant went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with a lull in conversation. It was more like a held breath, like every person in that room had looked up at the same moment and then very deliberately looked back down. My manager, Gerald, who was not a man easily rattled, appeared at my elbow with sweat along his hairline. "Table 9, he said. "Stellan Voss. He's a regular. Do not mess this up, Joe." I'd heard the name. Everyone in Chicago had heard the name. Voss Industries was the largest private construction and development firm in the Midwest, but that was the public story, the one that got printed in Forbes and the Tribune. The private story, the one whispered over happy hour drinks by people who thought they knew things, was considerably more complicated. The Voss family had built half of Chicago's infrastructure over 3 generations, and not all of it had been built with entirely clean hands, none of which prepared me for the actual experience of approaching Table 9. He was sitting alone, though 2 men in dark suits had positioned themselves near the bar, with the specific stillness of people paid to watch everything. Stellan Voss was, I'm going to be honest, because there's no point in not being honest at this point in the story. He was the most striking man I had ever seen in real life. Not handsome in a movie star way, striking. Sharp jaw, dark blonde hair pushed back from his face, pale gray eyes that registered everything, with an intensity I could feel from 6 feet away. He was wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car, and his expression when he looked up at me was utterly unreadable. "Good evening," I said. My voice didn't shake. I was proud of that. "Welcome to Crestwood. Can I start you off with something to drink?" He looked at me for a long moment, not in a rude way, exactly, but in the way of someone who is accustomed to taking inventory. "Water," he said. "And whatever Chef Brennan is calling his signature tonight." "The dry-aged ribeye," I said. "He's doing a black truffle compound butter with it. It's excellent." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. "You've tried it? Gerald lets us taste things on Sundays, for the sake of being able to describe them accurately practical." He studied me for another beat. "What's your name?" I gestured to my name tag. He glanced at it. "Joe," he said, and something about the way he said it, short and certain, like he'd decided something, made the hairs on my arms stand up. "I'll have the ribeye, Joe." I walked back to the service station, telling myself it meant nothing. He was a wealthy man having dinner. That was all. He stayed until close. Every time I came to his table, he paused whatever he was doing. At some point, a stream of people in expensive shoes had come and gone, speaking to him in low, urgent voices, and watched me with those gray eyes in a way that felt like being studied rather than admired. The tips were absurd. $400 on a $300 check, and when I chased his driver down in the parking lot to say there had been a mistake, the man looked at me like I was the one who was confused. "Mr. Voss doesn't make errors," he said simply. "Good night." I stood in the cold holding $400 cash and feeling like something had changed, though I couldn't have said exactly what. The flowers came the next morning. White peonies, not roses, peonies Hazel's favorite, which I had never told anyone at that restaurant, filling the entire kitchen counter of my apartment in Ukrainian Village. No card. I didn't need one. The day after that, a piano arrived. I want to be clear about how absurd this was. My apartment was 900 square feet on the second floor of a walk-up building. The delivery men brought a gorgeous upright Yamaha in polished mahogany, and it took 3 of them, 20 minutes of maneuvering to get it through the door. When I tried to refuse it, they showed me a signed delivery receipt and shrugged in the way of men who have been paid very well to not get involved in whatever is happening. Hazel pressed every single key in sequence 3 times before I could even think about what to say. There were more gifts after that, books for Hazel, the exact titles from her school reading list, which again I had told no one, a grocery delivery service subscription. A message from Gerald at work that Mr. Voss had specifically requested my section for his standing Wednesday reservation. I should have quit. I knew I should have quit. I thought about it seriously twice, standing in my kitchen at midnight after putting Hazel to bed, adding up reasons in my head. I thought about my checking account balance and Hazel's specialist copays, and the way the radiator still hadn't been fixed. And I went back on Thursday, and I smiled at table 9. He came twice a week after that. He rarely spoke beyond ordering, but he watched me constantly, not in a way that felt threatening, which was strange, because everything about his reputation suggested it should. It felt more like attention, like being the only person in the room someone was actually paying attention to. I told myself I was confusing a wealthy man's passing interest with something it wasn't. I told myself a lot of things. The night everything shifted, I was running on 4 hours of sleep because Hazel had been up half the night with a cough that turned out to be nothing, but that never stops you from imagining the worst. I was refilling Mr. Voss's water glass when my vision blurred at the edges, and I put my hand on the table to steady myself. His hand covered mine before I'd fully registered it happening. "When did you last sleep?" Not unkind, but direct in that way he had, where a question felt like a door he'd already decided to open. "I'm fine," I said. "Long night with my daughter." He stood up, just stood up, in the middle of dinner service, put cash on the table and said, "Gerald, she's done for the evening," in a voice that made Gerald say, "Of course," before his brain apparently caught up with his mouth. "I have a shift," I said. "You had a shift," he corrected, and picked up my apron from the service station as casually as if he'd been doing it for years. I should have refused. Every reasonable instinct I had said to refuse. But I was so tired, and he was standing there with his gray eyes and his certainty, and I said nothing. His car was waiting outside. A black Escalade with tinted windows, which should have terrified me, and somehow didn't. We rode through the city in the kind of silence that didn't feel uncomfortable, which was itself uncomfortable to notice. When we pulled up to my building in Ukrainian Village, I felt the tension release from my shoulders, right up until I saw the figure leaning against the stoop. Marcus, Hazel's father. We'd been together for 2 years, broken up when she was 6 months old, and in the 3.5 years since, he'd fluctuated between absent and inconvenient. He had a gambling problem that he occasionally acknowledged and more frequently denied, and lately his version of co-parenting had been to show up when he needed money and leave when I asked about child support. Stellan went still beside me. "You know him. He's Hazel's father." I watched Marcus clock the Escalade and straighten up, his expression doing the thing it did when he was recalibrating. "He's here about money," Stellan said something brief to his driver. Then he got out of the car. I couldn't hear what they said, but I watched Marcus's face go through several colors in the span of about 4 minutes, and when it was over, he walked to his truck and drove away without once looking back at me. "He won't be a problem," Stellan said simply, opening my door. That night, standing in my apartment doorway while he took in the space, the worn couch, Hazel's art projects, taped to the refrigerator, the piano that looked spectacular and completely out of place. I felt something I couldn't name. Not gratitude exactly. Something more complicated than that. Hazel was asleep on the couch, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest, Mrs. Kowalski from 3B dozing beside her on the cushions. Stellan looked at her for a long moment. The hardness in his face did something I hadn't expected. Not disappeared, exactly, but settled differently. "Your daughter," he said quietly. "Yes." He looked at me for another moment, then reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear with a gentleness so at odds with everything I'd heard about him that I didn't breathe. "Get some sleep, Joe," he said. "I'll be in touch." 2 days later, Marcus was found outside a casino on the west side with 3 broken ribs. The police report attributed it to a dispute over gambling debts. I knew better. The same day, FedEx delivered an envelope containing legal documents. Formal child support agreement, notarized, Marcus's signature on every page, the monthly amount more than 3 times what family court had ordered. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time looking at those papers. I left a thank you note with Gerald. That evening, a new iPhone was waiting at my station with Stellan already in my contacts. "Have dinner with me Friday," his first text read. It wasn't a question. I went. And then I went again and again, always somewhere private. A corner room at a restaurant he apparently owned a stake in, a rooftop space at one of his properties downtown, the kind of places where his word was the only law that mattered. He told me about his work in broad strokes. I told him about Hazel, about the job I'd had to leave when I was pregnant, about the music degree I'd been 1 semester from finishing when everything fell apart. He listened in a way that felt genuine, which I knew logically meant nothing, and which I felt deeply anyway. I told myself I understood what was happening. I told myself I had it under control. I was wrong. 3 weeks after that first dinner, I sat in his office on the 42nd floor of the Voss Industries building, with my hands folded in my lap and the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. On his desk, a folder lay open. Inside, photographs. Me yesterday afternoon, at a coffee shop in Lincoln Park, sitting across from a man I absolutely had not expected to see again. Josephine. His voice cut through the silence, quiet and precise. "Tell me about your afternoon," I swallowed. "I can't explain." He stood. He was very still for a large man, in the way of people who've learned that stillness communicates more than movement. He came around the desk until he was standing in front of me, and I had to tilt my head back to look at him. "Then explain," he said, "because what I'm looking at is you, sitting across from a man named Declan Marsh, who works for the state's attorney's office, and has been trying to build a case against my company for 18 months. His jaw tightened. "So I'd like to know what exactly the two of you discussed." "He approached me," I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. "He came into Crestwood last week, said he needed to speak with me privately. I thought. I didn't know what he wanted. I agreed to meet him because I was curious and a little scared. And you didn't tell me." "No, why?" I looked at him directly. "Because I was afraid of how you'd react." Something moved in his expression, some barely visible fracture in the composure. "What did he want?" "He said he had questions about Marcus, about what happened outside the casino." I watched his face, but that was just the opening. What he actually wanted was information about you, about Voss Industries, about things he thinks you're involved in that he can't prove. I paused. "He offered me protection, a new identity, money, said he could help Hazel and me relocate somewhere you'd never find us." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. "And did you consider it?" Stellan asked. I had. For approximately 30 seconds in that coffee shop, looking at photos Declan Marsh had spread across the table. Business rivals who had ended up in bad situations, zoning board members who had reversed decisions in Voss's favor under circumstances that never got investigated, union representatives who had stopped asking questions about certain labor contracts. I had considered it. "Yes," I said, for a moment, and then I told him I wasn't interested. Stellan watched me for a long moment. Why should I believe that? I stood. My knees weren't entirely steady, but I stood anyway. "Because I'm still here. Because I came to your office instead of a federal building." I held his gaze. "Because whatever I think about the things you've done, I wouldn't do that to you." He turned away, moving to the window. Chicago spread out below us in all its gray winter sprawl, and I watched the tension in his shoulders and thought about all the things I'd learned in 3 weeks that I hadn't expected to learn. "He told you I was dangerous," Stellan said. "Not a question. He showed me evidence that you were dangerous, and yet here you are. And yet here I am." I let out a breath, which probably says something concerning about my judgment. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "Declan Marsh has been trying to take down this company for the better part of 2 years. He's failed because he has no case. He doesn't have a case because I've been careful for a very long time." He turned back to me. "But you're right that he's persistent, and now that he's approached you, you're in his line of sight. What does that mean for us?" He went very still. Are there an us? I looked at him. 3 weeks ago, the question would have been easier to answer. I don't know what we are, I said. But something is happening between us, and I think you know it too, and I think pretending otherwise is a waste of both our time. For a moment, just a moment, something crossed his face that looked like relief. Then his phone buzzed on the desk and he looked down at it, and the moment was gone. Hazel, he said, I had Renata pick her up from your neighbor an hour ago. She's at my apartment. The air left my lungs. You did what? When I saw the photos of your meeting with Marsh, I needed to take precautions. Hazel is at my place with Renata, my housekeeper. She's safe. She's 5, I said, and my voice came out barely above a whisper. You took my 5-year-old daughter without telling me. I ensured she was protected while her mother was. While her mother was doing what? I cut him off, and something about my tone made him stop. Meeting with someone I didn't ask to meet, trying to figure out how to handle it without scaring you? That's what I was doing, Stellan. I grabbed my purse. Take me to her. Right now. He looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, something I would have called shame on anyone else. She's fine, he said, quieter. Renata says she's been watching cartoons and ate an entire bowl of macaroni and cheese. That's not the point, no, he said. It's not, you're right. He picked up his jacket. Come on, I'll take you. The ride to his building was silent. He lived in a tower on the lakefront that I'd walked past 100 times without imagining what it looked like inside. The private elevator, the biometric scanner, the way the security in the lobby straightened without being obvious about it. All of it was a reminder of exactly what kind of world I'd been orbiting for 3 weeks. The apartment took my breath away despite myself. Floor-to-ceiling windows facing the lake, the city lights reflected in the black water. Art on the walls that I was fairly certain was not decorative prints. And there, on an enormous sectional sofa in the living room, was my daughter in her school clothes, with a bowl of popcorn. Entirely absorbed in a cartoon, a silver-haired woman sitting nearby with her reading glasses and a magazine. Mama! Hazel launched herself off the couch. I caught her and held on for probably longer than was strictly necessary. Are you okay? I murmured into her hair. Renata let me pick my own movie and she made popcorn with real butter, Hazel informed me. And Stellan has a fish tank with actual clownfish. Can we see the fish? I looked over her head at Stellan, who was watching us with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. Open in a way he usually wasn't. Renata touched my arm as she passed. She was wonderful, she said softly. No trouble at all. After Hazel had been shown the fish tank, after she'd been given a bath in a bathroom bigger than my bedroom, and put into borrowed pajamas that Renata somehow produced perfectly sized, after she'd been settled into a guest room with a nightlight and her rabbit, which Stellan's driver had retrieved from my apartment, which I hadn't even known to be touched by until it happened. I walked back to the living room and found Stellan standing at the windows with a glass of whiskey. He offered me one. I took it. She's asleep, I said. She went down quickly. She was exhausted. He turned Joe. I'm sorry about the way I handled this, taking her without telling you. That was wrong. I hadn't expected the apology. It caught me off guard enough that I sat down on the sofa rather than continuing to stand there with my arms crossed. It was wrong, I agreed. My instinct, when I feel something is threatened, is to control the situation. He sat in the chair across from me. I'm aware that's not healthy? He almost smiled. I was going to say appropriate, but yes. He set his glass down. Your daughter is not a variable to be managed. I understand that. Hazel, I said. Her name is Hazel. I know her name. Then use it. He looked at me for a moment. Hazel, he said. She's remarkable, by the way. She told Renata 3 facts about anglerfish during the drive over, and corrected her on one of them. She's in a phase about deep-sea creatures, I said, against my will, feeling the tension ease slightly. It's been 3 months. Her teacher says she's very thorough. She sounds like you. I looked at him. How would you know what I'm like? We've had dinner 5 times. 6, he said. And I've watched you work in a high-pressure environment for 3 weeks without losing your composure once. I've seen you handle a difficult situation tonight with more dignity than most people I employ could manage. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I know what I see, Joe. The room felt warmer than it had a minute ago. Declan Marsh, I said, needing to stay on solid ground. What happens now? Now I deal with Marsh through appropriate channels. His investigation is circumstantial and he knows it. Something hardened in his expression. He approached you because he thought you were the weak point. He was mistaken. And am I asked. A weak point? He was quiet for a long moment. You're a complication I didn't expect, he said finally. Which is different. Tell me about your company, I said. The real version, not Forbes. I want to know what I've gotten myself into. He looked at me for a long moment. Then, all right. What followed was the most honest conversation I'd ever had with a man I'd known for less than a month. He told me about Voss Industries, the legitimate side, which was substantial. Commercial real estate, infrastructure contracts, a property development arm that employed over 2,000 people in the Chicago area. He told me about the other side, the way the company had operated under his grandfather's leadership, the relationships with aldermen and city officials that had made certain projects possible by means that didn't hold up to scrutiny. The way his father had continued those methods. The way Stellan had inherited them at 32, when his father had a heart attack that left him living but unable to work. Your father, I said. He's still alive? He's at a facility in Lake Geneva. He had a second event 8 months ago. He doesn't know who I am most days. Something careful moved across his face. I visit every few weeks, even though he's not a good man, no. He picked up his glass. He wasn't a good father, and he wasn't a good person, and he made my life significantly harder by the choices he made. But he's my father. I thought about that. Is that why you? I stopped. Why I what? Why you stepped in with Marcus? Without me asking. He looked at me steadily. A man who abandons his child doesn't deserve her. And a man who would use his daughter to manipulate her mother deserves considerably worse than what he got. My chest tightened. How did you know he was planning to? I told you that first night. I know things. He met my eyes. Marcus had gambling debts with people who saw an opening when I started showing interest in you. They offered him a deal. Re-establish contact with you. Get close. Gather information about me. He came to your stoop that night to start the process. The macaroni and cheese I'd stress-eaten an hour ago turned over in my stomach. He was going to use me. He was going to try. I made him a better offer. The child support agreement. His debts cleared, the papers signed, his continued well-being contingent on never approaching you or Hazel again. Stellan's voice was flat. He accepted immediately. The beating afterward was for the grocery store. Did you know he followed you there 2 weeks ago? My people flagged it. He'd been told what would happen if he made contact. I had noticed Marcus in the produce section. I'd thought it was coincidence. This is your world, I said quietly. Yes. He didn't apologize for it. This is my world. I'm not going to pretend it's something it isn't, Joe. But I'll tell you something I haven't told anyone outside this organization. He stood, and after a moment, gestured for me to follow. He took me to a room off the hallway. Not the public spaces, not the living room designed for impression. A private study lined with filing cabinets and 2 large monitors. He sat down and pulled up a series of documents. For the next hour, he showed me everything. The consulting firm he'd quietly hired 3 years ago to audit every line of business and identify legal exposure. The city contracts that had been quietly renegotiated to remove certain relationships. The alderman who had been informed carefully that Voss Industries was no longer in the business of those kinds of arrangements. The legitimate development projects now generating more revenue than the old methods ever had. You're trying to get clean, I said. I'm succeeding at getting clean. There's a difference. He turned to face me. It's not finished. There are people in my organization who don't share my vision. The transition creates vulnerability, which is why Marsh thinks now is his moment. He paused, and why I reacted the way I did when I saw those photos. You were scared, I said. He looked at me for a moment. I don't scare easily. That doesn't answer my question. Something shifted in his face. Yes, he said finally. I was scared. We sat in that study for a long time after that. He answered every question I asked, and I asked a lot of them, about the violence, about the men in those photos Marsh had shown me, about what it meant, practically, to be associated with someone whose past contained the things his did. His answers were honest in a way I hadn't expected, and honest in a way that wasn't entirely comfortable, because there was nothing in them that pretended to be something it wasn't. I've done things I can't undo, he said. I made a decision a long time ago that I would survive in the world I was given, and surviving required certain choices. I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm asking you." He stopped. "What are you asking me?" I said. He looked at the lake through the window. The lights on the water had multiplied in the hours we'd been talking. "I'm asking you to consider that the man I was is not the only version of what I can be." He turned to look at me. "I saw you that first night and something shifted. I know how that sounds. I know what it looks like from the outside. The powerful man deciding he wants something and pursuing it without asking. I know that's what this has looked like." "It's what it's been," I said. "The gifts, the way you manage things without telling me." "Yes." He didn't look away. "I know how to take, I'm not good at asking." He paused. "I'm asking now." The question hung between us without being spoken aloud. I thought about Hazel asleep down the hallway in borrowed pajamas, who had eaten popcorn with real butter and learned the names of fish and fallen asleep without fear. I thought about 3.5 years of radiators that didn't work, and copays I had to calculate before I made doctor's appointments, and a degree I'd abandoned because there was no time and no money, and no one to help me carry any of it. I thought about what Declan Marsh had offered me, and why I'd said no. "I need you to understand something," I said. "If we do this, whatever this is, Hazel is not a peripheral concern. She's not something that fits around the edges of your life. She comes first, in every decision, without negotiation, understood, immediate, no hesitation. And I need to be told things, not protected from things, told things. I can handle information. What I can't handle is being managed." He was quiet for a moment. "That's harder for me. I know. I'm telling you anyway. Fair." He looked at me. "And I need you to trust that when I tell you something is handled, it's handled. I'm not going to be able to show you every decision I make or explain every call. Some things you're better off not knowing. As long as Hazel is never one of those things. She will never be one of those things," he said, and the way he said it, low and certain, made me believe him. We sat with that for a moment. "I'm not agreeing to anything tonight," I said finally. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking you to. I'm saying I'll think about it." Something in his face, subtle, but there, the careful loosening of something held very tight. "That's enough," he said. "For now, that's enough." We went back to the living room after that. Renata had left tea on the coffee table and retired for the night, and we sat on opposite ends of the sectional sofa, with the lake outside the window and the city going about its business 40 floors below. And we talked for another hour about things that had nothing to do with investigations, or power, or choices made in dark rooms. He told me about learning to sail as a kid on Lake Michigan. I told him about the music professor who had called my final recital piece structurally audacious, technically imperfect, and entirely memorable. He laughed at that, a real laugh, unexpected, transforming his face entirely. At some point, I fell asleep on the sofa. I woke to daylight, and the smell of coffee, and Hazel's voice in the kitchen, explaining to Renata the difference between a viperfish and a dragonfish. Stellan was in the kitchen when I walked in, dressed already on his second cup of coffee, entirely absorbed in whatever Hazel was telling him about bioluminescence. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway, and something in his expression went still, and then settled, like a held breath released. "Mama, did you know that dragonfish have teeth that are too big for their mouths?" Hazel informed me. I did not know that. Stellan didn't know either, but now he does. She climbed onto a bar stool with the confidence of a child who has decided a space is hers. "Can we have the fish for breakfast? The eggs." "She means the scrambled eggs," Stellan said. "Renata made them in the shape of fish. There's been a request for a repeat performance." Renata appeared from the other end of the kitchen looking pleased. 15 minutes, she said to Hazel, who approved this. I poured coffee and stood next to Stellan at the counter, while Hazel interrogated Renata about whether she knew the average depth of the Mariana Trench. "She asked me that this morning," Stellan said quietly. "I got it wrong by about 2,000 feet. She'll correct you every time," I said. "Don't feel bad. She's corrected her teacher twice." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did you think about it?" I looked at him. The morning light made him look different, less composed, more human. There were faint circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept much. "Some," I said. "I'll think about it more." I turned my coffee cup in my hands. "There's something I want to ask you. Ask the gifts," I said. "From the beginning, the flowers, the piano. You knew about Hazel's books, her reading list, things I'd never told you. I met his eyes. How long had you been paying attention before I noticed? He held my gaze. 3 weeks before you were assigned to my table. I'd seen you the first time I came in and requested you the following visit. Gerald took a while to comply. 3 weeks. I know how that sounds. It sounds like something Declan Marsh would have a field day with in a courtroom, I said. A pause. And then, unexpectedly, it probably would. Something almost like amusement in his voice. Why? I asked. I was a waitress. You have access to half this city. He looked at me for a long moment. I have access to half this city, he said. That means I know a great deal about what half this city is willing to do for money or influence. I know who people become when they're trying to impress me, or afraid of me, or both. He paused. You were the first person who treated me like you had no idea who I was, and absolutely no interest in finding out. You recommended the ribeye like you were completely indifferent to whether I ordered it or not. I was, I said. The tip structure is the same either way. I know. He smiled briefly, and the exhaustion in his face did something unexpected when he smiled. That was the point. Hazel materialized at my elbow, demanding to know if she could have orange juice, and the moment closed. But I held it carefully, turned it over, added it to the list of things I was assembling about Stellan Voss. The decision I'd already half made the night before felt more solid in the daylight. 6 months later, the renovation on the house in Evanston finished 2 weeks before Hazel started kindergarten, which Stellan had timed deliberately. He planned things like that, years out, with a thoroughness that had initially frustrated me, and that I had mostly come to find reassuring. The house was 4 blocks from the school, and had a yard with an old oak tree and a porch swing, and absolutely nothing about it. Announced itself as belonging to one of the most powerful men in Chicago. That was intentional too. Hazel had started calling him Stellan within the first month, which she informed us was because Stellan is his name and names are important. By month 3, she had started occasionally, in moments of distraction, calling him Dad. The first time it happened, I watched him go very still in the way he did when something mattered, and then he said, "Yeah, Bug?" in a voice that was not entirely steady, and Hazel didn't notice because she was asking him to reach something from a high shelf. I noticed. The Voss Industries transition was complete in most of the ways that mattered. There had been difficult nights. Stellan coming home late with the look he sometimes had, the one I'd learned not to press on until he was ready, the one that meant something complicated, had happened in a world I was only partially allowed into. There had been arguments, real ones, about exactly what I was and wasn't allowed to know about, a boundary we negotiated and renegotiated on a rolling basis. Declan Marsh had quietly reassigned to a different case, 6 months into his investigation, a development Stellan told me about with the expression of someone who has nothing further to add on the subject. I hadn't asked further. That was its own kind of learning. The night of the Voss Foundation Gala. The first time we'd appeared together publicly, the coming out of a version of Stellan Voss the city hadn't seen before. I was standing in the bedroom of the Evanston house in the dress he'd had made for me, a deep green thing that felt like wearing something important, and he appeared in the doorway in his tuxedo and looked at me for a moment in silence. "You look," he started, and then didn't finish. "Thank you," I said. "You look nervous." "I don't get nervous. Stellan, mildly apprehensive," he said. I crossed the room and straightened his pocket square, which didn't need straightening. He put his hand over mine and held it there. "There's something I need to do before we go," he said. "Hazel's already dressed," I said. "She's been in her room rehearsing her flower girl walk. Don't tell her that's not what tonight is." "It might be," he said. I looked at him. He reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo and produced a ring box, dark blue velvet, and looked at me with those gray eyes that I had spent 6 months learning the language of. He didn't kneel. He wasn't a kneeling kind of man. We both knew that, but he opened the box, and the ring inside was a pale green tourmaline surrounded by small diamonds. The color of the dress, the color he knew was my favorite, and it was so specifically chosen that my throat closed around anything I might have said. "Joe," he said, "I'm not going to tell you I'm a good man, because you know better and you've earned the right to that honesty. What I can tell you is that I intend to spend the rest of my life making choices that deserve you and Hazel, and I want to do it officially." He paused. "I'm asking, not telling. Asking. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about a closed radiator and a pile of medical bills moved from drawer to drawer. I thought about table 9, and the way the room had gone quiet when he walked in, and the way he'd looked at Hazel over a bowl of popcorn, like she was something he hadn't known he was waiting for. "Yes," I said. "Obviously, yes." He put the ring on my finger and then put his arms around me and held on in the way that he did sometimes, the way that meant something he didn't have words for, and I held on back. Hazel appeared in the doorway in her purple dress with her hair in braids and announced that she had practiced walking slowly 7 times and was ready to throw flowers. Stellan pulled back and looked at her. "We have something to tell you first," he said. She looked between us. Then she looked at my hand. 5-year-olds notice more than people expect. "Are you married now?" she asked. "Almost," I said. "Because I have to be the flower girl," she said seriously. "Renata told me that's what the flower girl does, and I have been practicing." "You'll absolutely be the flower girl," Stellan said. He crouched down to her level. "Is that okay with you? Joe and me getting married?" Hazel considered this for a moment with the gravity of a person whose opinion genuinely matters. Then she put her arms around his neck and he caught her automatically, standing back up with her against his chest. "Yes," she said, "but I get to pick the cake flavor." "Done," he said immediately. She pulled back to look at him with her serious face. "And we get to keep the fish tank." That was never in question. She nodded, satisfied, and squirmed down to go collect her flower girl rehearsal petals, which she had apparently already sourced from somewhere. We watched her go. Stellan reached over and took my hand, his thumb running over the ring. "She drives a hard bargain," I said. "She's negotiating from a strong position," he said. "She knows she already has everything she wants." I looked at him. He was watching Hazel with the expression I'd first seen through a hotel doorway 6 months ago. That careful, open thing he only let himself have when he thought no one was paying attention. I was always paying attention. Outside the windows, the October evening had turned the lake the color of slate, and somewhere downtown the Voss Foundation Gala was waiting for its centerpiece, for the newest chapter of a family that had spent 3 generations accumulating power in the shadows, and was now, slowly, learning what it meant to build something that didn't require them. I had spent 2 years telling myself the exhaustion was temporary, that I was working towards something, even when I couldn't see what. Turns out I just hadn't met the right complication yet.